Okay, and welcome back. So last time we talked about this crazy moment where conceptual art and performance art explodes into the 60s and 70s. And I just want to go back and talk a little bit about what happens to modernism. If you remember, by the late 1950s, modernism was the predominant art force. It was this kind of universal art movement that was believed to be the end-all and be-all of art. You had Clement Greenberg, Harold Rosenberg, all these critics basically declaring that that's it, art was done. We weren't going to do anything else. And then it all went to crap because pop art, conceptual art, performance, all these crazy things came in, and the new generation of artists said, yeah, we don't like your modernism. Your modernism is too closely associated with this consumerist culture, this big money culture, and so they pushed back. And modernism does not go quietly into, does not go gently into that dark night, let's say. It fights for a good long time, and it's still there. It's still around. And it still has a profound influence. The ideas of abstraction, of expression, of non-figuration, of trying to get moved to the pristine, the pure, those things, those ideas that were introduced all the way back at the beginning of the 20th century by people like Kandinsky and Malevich and others, those ideas don't die out very easily. But it's clear that as pop art becomes dominant throughout the 60s, and we have performance and new media and all kinds of other things happening, that it has to go somewhere. And so it does. It changes. It changes a lot. And Clement Greenberg is the person who tries to pioneer a kind of new direction for this. He puts together a show, and the show is called Post-Painterly Abstraction, is what he calls it. So the idea is that, abstraction before this was all about the action of the painter, that, you have Jackson Pollock dripping things. And instead, they decide that, no, it's going to be more thoughtful. And in a way, this is a reaction to pop art. Pop art had very shiny, very glossy images, things that were made with, silkscreen or whatever. And so it makes sense that abstraction would get to more geometric forms, shinier, glossier images. It also makes sense that they would move away from things like gesture, where you're flinging paint around, or stabbing at the canvas like a de Kooning, or flinging it around like a Jackson Pollock, and instead you would paint it in a more orderly fashion, in a geometric fashion. So that's why it's called, post-painterly. Painterly is the expression, the mark of the artist. It's the gesture of the artist, and they dropped that in favor of more direct geometric abstraction. So this really is both a response to conceptual art, where it's the thought of the art, it's the concept of the piece that matters. And it's also a response to the kind of glossy, slick images of pop art. It is the pop art and conceptual art response, but it still tries to keep the fundamentals. It's going to be abstraction. And so we see this interesting development come about. Kenneth Nolan is one of the first. You can still see a touch of the expressive here. Most of these circles are perfectly concentric, but then we have a bit of the splash. You can see the drips of the blue paint around the outside. But very quickly he just gets rid of that entirely, and he starts painting pure geometric forms. He goes through a bunch of circles, winds up moving into V's and chevrons, these kind of V-nested V shapes. And these are made, again, more mechanically. The color is laid on very flat. There isn't any attempt to show the mark of the artist. Again, the abstract expressionists were trying to remove the artist from the process. The process became the art, and this goes even a step further. And so they do get kind of glossy and slick and smooth, a lot like, pop art images. Probably the most extreme example of this is going to be Ab Reinhardt. Ab Reinhardt starts painting these flat surfaces. He develops these 12 rules for art. And in the 12 rules, he says there should be no figuration, no texture, no discernible brushwork whatsoever. That he's getting rid of anything that gives any kind of unique character or sense of the artist's mark. So this is abstraction, but it's kind of a repudiation of the abstract expressionists. And sometimes this gets so extreme that we wind up with Ab Reinhardt painting these black on black paintings. This painting, believe it or not, it just looks like a black square, but it's not. if you get close enough to these paintings, and I don't know if you can see it in this slide, you can tell there are subtle variations. We have a cross, one of a slightly grayer black on top of a darker black. So you have like rectangles and squares of just incredibly subtle differences. There's none of these thin layers like in a Mark Rothko, however. It's all painted on and it looks as flat as if it was put on with a paint roller. So we're dealing in very subtle ideas of tonalities, real simplicity. And it's these kind of ideas that emerge that bring forth what we call minimalism. Minimalism is the inheritor of the kind of high modernism of the 50s and 60s. And what's interesting is most of the minimalists didn't call it minimalism. They actually called it, Donald Judd didn't like to call it minimalism. He liked to call it purism. The idea being that they were going to strip away everything extemporaneous to art. All the brushwork, all the treatment of surfaces, all of that. And they were going to distill it all down to the most minimal, pure form that they could. And they would emphasize the objecthood, you know, the same thing that was present in abstract expressionism and post-painterly abstraction. They would emphasize the objecthood of it. And a lot of this was made with industrial, ready-made materials to emphasize those kind of qualities. The pioneer of this is going to be a guy named Frank Stella, who made these kind of monochrome process paintings. And his process was extraordinarily simple. He would get these large canvases. Well, canvases have to have stretchers. Those are bars in the back of the canvas that keep the thing flat and stiff. And wherever those stretchers were, he would begin painting, and he would paint exactly the width of his large brush, and he would paint these lines. And so he's not even the one determining where the lines are on his canvas. These are determined by the actual stretcher bars inside the canvas. And the width of those lines is the exact same width of the stretcher bars. So do you see what we talk about, how this being part of the process? He is essentially just, in a way, augmenting the ground, the material itself, and elevating that to the form. The title here is really kind of interesting because it's Raise the Flag, which was the title of a Nazi anthem, which is fascinating. But again, it has this kind of very kind of chauvinistic appeal that we are emphasizing the materiality of the thing. The person who really defines minimalism going forward is going to be Donald Judd. And Donald Judd himself is quite the character. Donald Judd starts as an art critic and was one of the sharpest critics of the pop artists. He wrote a scathing review of Andy Warhol, basically saying, you know, if he's not a fraud, he's a lunatic. And it's a pretty harsh way to review it. And he decides that he's, you know, been an art critic for a while, that he's got to get into this. He's got to get into this and start creating his own work, almost as a response to what he considered to be the shallow superficiality of pop art. So he tries to create the same kind of sense that Stella was creating in his paintings, but creating them using materials, industrial materials in 3 dimensions. And he starts making things like this, large boxes made out of ready-made industrial materials, aluminum, steel, plexiglass, those kind of things. When he created these, the first ones he made himself, but he wasn't really an engineer or a craftsman by training, and he was frustrated that it showed the kind of means of manufacture. And he didn't want that. He wanted something that was absolutely, created almost to aerospace engineering standards, so that you were not distracted by the means of manufacture. You could just concentrate on the object and the sense of the shape and the proportion and the materials of the object. It's very fascinating. A lot of these minimalist sculptors in the 1960s and 70s just lacked the skills to engineer their artwork to that degree, and so they sought out engineering and fabrication firms to do that. And there was an aerospace firm in Massachusetts, of all place, that somebody found and said, yeah, sure, we'll make your crazy boxes for you. And they started making them, And now today, that firm is still around, but they don't do aerospace anymore. They do almost entirely high-end engineering for artists who want to do this stuff. So they actually created a whole new industry of the mass production. And it's kind of fascinating because in a way, while this is a response to pop art, it's very similar to pop art. Pop art was using ready-made, printed materials and technologies. This was using ready-made industrial technologies. They're both very shiny. They're both very glossy. They both elevate the status of the material, the kind of mass-produced world. So while in a way it's a kind of critique of pop art, it has a lot in common with pop art in the fact that, just like Andy Warhol named his studio The Factory, and at the end of his career, he wasn't even really, at the end of his career in the 60s, he wasn't even making art anymore. He had other people doing that for him. He had, he was the kind of thinker or art director of a business, and Andy Warhol ran his studio more like a brand than he ran it like an actual art studio. And the same thing was true of these minimalists, that they were running ideas as brands, and they would come up with these concepts and, outside the first few objects that Donald Judd made, he never made another one of his works of art. He just drew up the designs and specified the materials and handed off to a fabrication firm to create it. So you can see how his works are all about this just simple sense of proportion. So here we have these series of boxes. The boxes are mounted to the wall, and they are separated by a distance equal to the size of the box itself. So all we have left is this kind of system of ideal proportions. Donald Judd was an interesting guy, and he actually took a trip across the United States, broke down in West Texas, in the middle of nowhere, Marfa, Texas, and while he was there, he noticed that there was an old abandoned Army air base there, an Army air base from World War II, and he looked out on this really kind of bleak West Texas environment, and he said this would be an ideal place to create an artist community where artists could come and build installations that were site-specific. And so this is how the Chinati Foundation gets started. And so the Chinati Foundation and the Judd Foundation are still in Marfa, Texas today. And he had one of these, buildings, these outbuildings from the air base rebuilt, and in it he placed his 100 works in mill aluminum. What's interesting about this is it shows how there's a kind of theatricality to minimalism. It likes large scales, but it also deals with the environment. If you look at these boxes, their outer dimensions are identical in every single way, but their inner dimensions are completely different. Sometimes they're a box within a box, sometimes they have an angled surface. And it's not the works themselves that's the work, it's the interaction with light. It's these enormous windows on both sides of this large hall, and so as the light moves across it, the subject is constantly changing. So you're left here with a kind of question, what is the artwork? Is the artwork the actual aluminum boxes? Or is the artwork the interplay of light and space around the boxes? And of course, that's as much a part of the artwork. And again, this is in a way a response to performance. Performance was all about breaking boundaries between the art and the object, and the artist and the object, by getting the audience to interact, to make things that, were specific to a site, that couldn't be sold, to avoid the claim of commercialism. You're not making an object that can be put in a gallery, sold, and put in a museum or some rich person's collection. You're making something that only exists for a moment, or it exists for performance. And by making these site-specific works, this is part of the foundation that runs this. They were never intended to be sold. They were just there to create a large-scale installation. He has another massive installation on this site, which is the 15 Untitled Works in Concrete. All of Donald Judd's works are functionally untitled. They have kind of little nicknames so that we can keep them apart. This is something that a lot of the locals thought was maybe an abandoned, water project because it's otherwise inexplicable. But it's a space that you really could only understand walking around it. And again, these large slabs of concrete, it almost has a Stonehenge-like quality to it. It's not really about the concrete blocks. It's more about the interaction of space and light. And you can see that As you certainly look at the shadows here, some of these boxes are open and you can pass through them. Some of them are closed. It creates a really interesting dynamic space that's constantly changing as the light in the West Texas sun moves across the sky. So a lot of this is, again, moving away from, objecthood. So while minimalism emphasized the object interacts with its environment in a way that it's inseparable, it's site-specific. Tony Smith was another one who was creating these kind of things, and they started working again in these very strong, durable industrial materials, working in Cor-10 steel. Cor-10 steel is a steel that rusts, but then the rust produces a protective patina that prevents it from decaying anymore. Some of these minimalist statues will just last forever. This one's called die, like a singular for dice, and it's just a simple cube. That's all it is, but it's over 6 feet tall, so it creates this kind of monolithic-like presence. Here's another example. This one, again, he calls Free Ride, and this one is just the intersection of 3 identical kind of rectangular spaces that intersect but give a different sense of form depending on what side you're looking at it. Very simple stuff, but very powerful stuff. Carl Andre was perhaps one of the most influential of all the minimalist sculptures, and he started off by making these kind of intersecting blocks of wood. He would cut them so they could be stacked up. That was his earliest stuff, but he eventually decided, and I love the quote here, he says, "I realized the wood was better before I cut it than after. I did not improve it in any way." And so instead of cutting them to make these kind of interesting patterns, he starts just stacking them up. He cuts the wood into kind of set lengths and then stacks them up. Each, piece then becomes a kind of little segment, a kind of bit of data of the larger whole. And then once he did that, he realized, well, crap, I don't even really have to do that. I have pre-made materials that I can do that with. And so he starts stacking bricks. And so he had these fire bricks, and he would stack these bricks into a single line. And people started really scratching their head over that. He made a whole series of these called the equivalent series, because each pile of brick here is equivalent in the number of bricks. And the question was here, okay, so I've got a brick. The brick is a single unit. How do I build up those units, almost like pixels, into as many different regular shapes that only had, 4 angles as possible? And so he made these. Each one of these has exactly the same number of bricks, 120. But, some are square, some are more rectangular, some are long and thin. And so he was just exploring the idea of how a simple shape building up can create many shapes. And you got to imagine this is really pushing the boundaries. And again, this is kind of a response to conceptual art. Because while this is minimal, the concept here is how many shapes, or what is the form that I can create with these 120 bricks. And this one was bought by the Tate Gallery. The Tate Gallery is probably the most prestigious national gallery in England. It's now broken up into 3 museums. It wasn't broken up into 3 museums then. There was the Tate Britain, the Tate, and the Tate Modern are now. But this was all one gallery at the time. So when the most prestigious national gallery in England buys this thing, it causes just an absolute sensation. How is a pile of bricks a work of art? So this is modernism's take on conceptualism. That we take a pre-existing object, a ready-made, and we create it to create an abstract kind of form, but it's based on this number of 120 bricks. It's really kind of interesting. And people were almost uniformly negative to this, and I think you can understand why. This is how extreme it got. Another artist who was creating in this way was Soloet. Soloet was, again, very interested in process. And his artwork is not determined by the, again, like Carl Andre's works were determined by the number of bricks and the size of the bricks. what he did is he took a cube and he created a whole series of iterations of cubes in many different forms. So this cube, you could see, every cube has 6 sides, and it has a set number of edges. And so he created an entire iteration of these cubes with different numbers of edges, every possible combination. This is almost like computing. It's not even like art at this point. It's like, okay, how many edges are there to a cube? How many different iterations of that can we produce? But even took it one further, really blending conceptual art with minimalism. He started to create these series of instructions, and he would issue them with formal certificates like this, giving instructions. And you can see this. And the instructions are all divided vertically into 15 equal parts, each with a different line, direction, and color, and all combinations. It gives the specifics there. He signs it, he gives a little diagram of it, and then he hands it off to you. And so the great thing about a Sol LeWitt piece is you can get this certificate and you can create your own Sol LeWitt in any space. And they will all follow the same basic rules, almost like a program, but because the spaces are different, they'll all be different. He did a wide iterations of these. And so Sol LeWitt's kind of installations are still being created today, but each one is unique based upon who's creating it. This was one that, said that you had to draw lines from the corners in the room and from the midpoints in the room to other directions in these colors. Well, depending on the size of the room, you get a different iteration. The same thing is true with this one. This one, you start with one line and then you trace that one line, but of course variations and iterations would create it, and this has been replicated many times. This also then begs the question, what's the work of art? Is the work of art the final object that's been produced here? Or is the work of art the actual certificate of the concept? So modernism had this very minimal, reduced aesthetic that was all about formal ideals and formal aesthetic ideals, but you can see that this idea of interaction, of removing the sense of the objecthood of the thing, of integrating people and variation and change, and also integrating the conceptual, all of these things were impacting modernism. So modernism still exists, but it gets changed quite a bit. All of this, of course, leads to a movement we call postminimalism. Remember what I say about post? Every time we put post in front of something in art history, it means, I don't know, it's just, we don't know what to call it. All we know is what it comes after. So we call it postminimalism. It shares a lot of the same ideals of minimalism, but it takes it further. Postminimalism starts, minimalism really is moving in the 60s and early 70s, but postminimalism gets started a little bit later, and in a way it's kind of a rejection of minimalism. A lot of the minimalist artists were getting very rich. They were creating these beautiful shiny boxes. They were getting sold in galleries. They were making quite a lot of money. Donald Judd made enough money that he could buy that whole airbase and turn it into his own private installation where he could invite artists to come and do their own installations as well. Robert Morris was one of the founders of minimalism, and he turned out to be one of the founders of postminimalism as a kind of rejection. And again, the idea was, okay, we're in love with these shiny metallic mass-produced objects, and that's really still a kind of form of gross consumerism. And we need to get past that. So they started moving in more the direction of soft materials and processes more than actual kind of objects. So Robert Morris, who was making things in plywood, started making things in felt. And he starts making things that look like vestments from an alien race. They're kind of fabulous. These very thick, heavy felt objects that he cuts into patterns. But even that becomes a little bit too regimented for him. And he started looking at the scraps on the floor from his works and saying, those are more interesting. So he starts piling up scraps into heaps and making these heaps into constructions. Now, let me tell you, if you're a curator of a pile of scraps, that's an incredibly hard thing to curate because you want it to be stacked in the way that the artist stacked it. But at the same time, the whole point of the artist is that you can't restack it exactly the same way. It's fluid. It has this quality of change. And of course, when Robert Morris's works need to be moved from one gallery to another, the curators take a lot of photos of how it was arranged, and they come and they arrange it to something in the spirit of the original, but not exactly, because there's no way to do it exactly. It becomes a kind of evolving work of art, something that emphasizes change. The artist Richard Serra was so committed to this that he actually said that you shouldn't think of art in terms of nouns, but you should think of art in terms of verbs, and he created this verb list as his kind of inspiration. Notice that it says things like to crease, to fold, to brand, to shorten, to twist, to scatter, to arrange, to discard, to modulate, to distill. You know, all of these things are, you know, things that you do to stuff. It's not the stuff itself. That the stuff is itself not important. It's the action that the stuff has. And so he started creating these massive works of art. And these things are every bit as big as some of the other minimalist pieces, but you can see they have an entirely different character. This is called One Ton Prop, or House of Cards. And it's made out of these thick 1-inch lead sheets. And these sheets are insanely heavy. And there's nothing connecting these sheets. There's no kind of, you know, mechanical connection between these. He just set them up and leaned them against each other so that they have this tenuous kind of touch and go. Consider how different that is to kind of Tony Smith's die. Tony Smith's die is constructed, solid, made out of Corten steel. That thing's not going anywhere. And instead you have this thing that's just a bunch of lead sheets leaning on each other. I mean, the whole thing could fall down, and if it did, I mean, they do take precautions to keep people away from it. I mean, oh my gosh. Being a curator of modern and contemporary art is just an enormous headache, because the materials are so diverse and the objects are so hard to curate because they are not solid. They're not, you know, even when they're solid, they move, they can shift, all these kind of things. So this is what we would call form versus anti-form. You know, the minimalists were making things that were concrete, solid, just impenetrable, and the post-minimalists were saying, no, let's take some of those same ideas and let's invert them to create something that breaks, you know, kind of those ideas. Probably the best example of this is Richard Serra starts making these massive installations, and he made probably one of the most controversial works of art of the late 20th century. This is Tilted Arc. This is Federal Plaza. This is in New York City, and because this is a federal piece of property, it came under the GSA, the General Services Administration, which manages all federal properties, which means that even though this was New York City, the federal government could commission this work of art without approval from New York City, and that's exactly what they did. And this was a very popular square. This was a place where there were, you know, food trucks, lunch venues, hot dog stands, you know, merchants, vendors, street performers, etc. And people used to come out of the buildings and gather around the fountain. It was a very popular place to gather. But then Richard Serra gets in there and he creates this tilted slab of Corten steel that just cuts the entire plaza in half, and it totally destroyed the pedestrian foot traffic in the area. It created an echo, and it became this imposing wall that just killed a public space. And it quickly became a site for graffiti and vandalism. It's an amazing story, and he wanted that to happen. He wanted this square to be bisected, to force people to go around it. And he was committed to this site-specific idea. Remember, he's the guy who made the verb list. Remember, one of those verbs was to scatter. What he really wanted to do was to force people to move around this thing, to be an interactive thing. Well, ultimately, I think you have to say it was a failure, because it was so alienating. It made its space unusable, and it ended up changing the way we do public art. So today, you know, even if a piece of property is owned by a private entity or a federal entity, they pretty much have to consult with the city and the public to say, hey, we're going to put a work of art here. It has to meet community standards, and otherwise it ends up being just a kind of disaster. The city tried many times to get Serra to move it, and he refused. He said it's meant for that location and no other location. And it wound up in the courts. It was lawsuits going back and forth. Eventually, they just decided that it had to go. And in the middle of the night, the city of New York came in and removed it, cut it up into 3 pieces. And they tried to give it back to him. They tried to get another location to put it, and Serra absolutely refused. He says, that was the location. I designed it for that location. There's no other location. So as I understand it, it's still owned by the federal government, but it's lying in 3 pieces and is in storage in a government storage facility in Maryland. Kind of fascinating, and is a lost work of art, and probably always will be. Richard Serra continues to work in this vein, and he's probably most famous for his massive installations. This one he did for the Bilbao in Spain. And this one was much better received, I think, because the location was built for it. So here you have a series of intersecting circles and spirals. This gives you the same kind of sense of going into, like a slot canyon in Utah. These narrow and interesting spaces, and the tilts and the angles that they produce, the sense of scale. Again, it's not the metal that's the work of art. It's the interaction and experience that people have with the work of art. One thing that post-minimalism did is this is right at the height of the feminist movement, that feminism is happening in the end of the late 60s, the beginning of the early 70s. Remember, the first feminist artists are painting at this time. And post-minimalism also saw itself as a reaction to the chauvinism and masculinity of minimalism. Minimalism was embracing these hard, shiny, metallic surfaces, these mass-produced things. This was all considered to be a kind of chest-thumping masculinity and chauvinism. And Linda Bengalis was one of these artists who initially rejected the idea of feminist art. She wanted to be an artist that was on her own terms. She later became known as one of the most aggressive feminist artists because it was so hard to get attention as a female artist. She took out this rather controversial ad in the art forum where she was naked with a large... oh gosh. See, every time I do this, I have to remind myself my mom's going to be listening to this stuff. It's contemporary art, Mom. There's no way to avoid it. Anyhow, she shows herself. She took out an ad in Art Forum magazine showing herself nude with a large prosthetic device. I'll just say it, a dildo. And, to deliberately kind of, force people to acknowledge, how women are being ignored. And of course, this appropriation of this artificial or faux masculinity and hypersexuality as well. But I really like the other stuff she does. I think her post-minimalist stuff is really fascinating. And she decided she was not going to work in these, kind of shiny metal industrial materials. Even though she still worked in industrial materials, she worked in latex and resin, pouring these things out, allowing them to take on an organic form. These materials would be liquid, but then they would solidify, creating undulating like forms, almost like waves of lava. And they're quite beautiful the way they sit in corners. You can think of these as the antithesis to Carl Andre's work. This is a work that she actually said for Carl Andre. And so Carl Andre was, working towards regimented shapes out of these pre-made industrial bricks, and she was pushing in the opposite direction deliberately. You gotta love how the artists of this era just clap back at each other constantly. Oh my gosh. You think celebrities, clapping back on each other on Twitter and Instagram are, oh my gosh, these artists really knew how to skewer people. So this one was made for Carl Andre and was a direct response to his bricks. And I think was a call to say that your bricks lack vital life force, or you've regimented everything until you've sucked the kind of life out of it. She would also do these kind of wonderful experimental forms where she would create forms and then pour the plastics or resins over the form. They would then harden, and then she would remove the forms. So you have this almost suspended, splash-like, lava-like forms. They're just really compelling. She wasn't the only one doing stuff like this. You also have Eva Hesse, who's creating boxes. But while these boxes have a kind of minimalist aspect to them, she would fill them with almost like cilia made out of latex tubing, giving it an almost interior organic, more biological quality. She would do the same thing with strings, working out strings and fiberglass and resin to create suspended organic forms that would then become rigid after the fact. That, again, they embrace the textile, they embrace the organic. Really beautiful stuff. And one of the more important artists of this movement would be Yayo Kusama. And she was a Japanese artist who immigrates to America. And she starts off really as an abstract expressionist, painting very expressive brush paintings. But these paintings become increasingly more about process. She started painting lots of little dots, what we call these net paintings. And so this is an infinity net. You can see have these wonderful textured brushstrokes in the detail that make this kind of undulating surface. Eventually she moves to works of soft sculpture, creating accumulations of all kinds of things on chairs and surfaces, working towards the organic. She would also participate in these, dressing up. So she took on the ideal concept of performance as well, of the artist integrating. And she would make these forms, and she loves great love of polka dots and repeated forms. But she's also one of the first to create mirrored rooms to get a sense of space or depth. She's still around making fabulous stuff. And she's had a whole second career kind of creating light works where she creates these infinity rooms where lamps are hanging in a room, and just to walk into this is incredible. Again, a kind of minimalist aesthetic, but maximalist in its force. Really wonderful. And this is a good space to talk about where modernism goes. One of the great things about the 20th century is we invented a lot of cool stuff. We invented lights. Of course, incandescent light goes all the way back to Edison. We have fluorescent lights coming from Tesla and etc. But we invented light and sound and all kinds of technological innovations. And it just made sense that at the time that artists were becoming more experimental in media, they would look to integrate this. And so a West Coast movement coming out of California starts off what will become the light and space movement, where artists say, ultimately light and, is one of the major features of painting, because the painting has to be lit to be seen, and you're using paint and color and tone to, deal with light. Why don't we just go right to the light itself and use light itself as a medium? There's a whole number of artists that do this. They're the most prominent. Probably one of the most prominent early on is Danflavin. So Danflavin starts taking these fluorescent bulbs and starts mounting them on the wall to create lightscapes, where the light is suggestive of the palette of a famous artist. He was famous for taking famous early modernist artists like Mondrian, etc., and creating works based on their palette. You can actually see it here. This one's untitled, but it's dedicated to Matisse. And you can see that he's borrowing the teals and the pinks and the oranges, and these shine out onto the walls, these fluorescent tubes. Here you can see how he works with this in spaces. He has this grid of fluorescent tubes, and some of the fluorescent tubes face away from us, and so we only see the reflected light of the blues and greens, while others are facing out towards us so we can see the tube itself, creating these bizarre simultaneous contrasts and these areas of light that are really quite beautiful. So Danflavin was a friend of Donald Judd, so Donald Judd invites him to come out to Marfa and to retrofit a bunch of these abandoned barracks and turn them into massive light installations. He eventually has a falling out with Donald Judd and ends up saying screw it and leaves the project. Donald Judd then dies, and then the Chinati Foundation says, well, can you come back and finish this? Because it remained unfinished for a very long time. So it's now one of the permanent installations there. But these barracks were these U-shaped barracks. And so his plan was to cover the hallways entirely in white, kind of drywall and paint them to this smooth surface, and then create these two tunnels near the back. You can see these kind of two tunnels in this model. So you would enter in, and the only light would be a single natural window at the back behind you, and you would come down to these tunnels, and then as you went into these tunnels, you would see, again, this wonderful simultaneous contrast of some of the tubes facing towards you and some facing away from you, creating these incredible interplays of light. You really have to go to this site to experience what this feels like. Danflavin's works are really in a perilous state right now. He knew that these fluorescent tubes wouldn't last forever, and so when he made these, he made provisions to have these colored fluorescent tubes bought in mass quantities so that they could be replaced as they burned out. But unfortunately, we're coming to the end of those stores, and no one is manufacturing them now. And so the question then becomes, again, it's another one of these curating nightmares. Do we try to replicate this with new LED bulbs, or do we just let the works of Danflavin die? It's always a hard question. Again, many of these artists recognize that their works were not permanent, that they had a lifetime. You also see artists like Robert Irwin. Robert Irwin was also experimenting with light and shadow. He would take these plexiglass forms that would be semi-translucent and then shine the light through them to create interplays of shadows. This is such an amazing work of art. It's almost like a magic trick. Even when you're staring right at it and you know what you're seeing, it's hard to get a sense of what you're looking at. I know, it looks just like a dirty smudge there in the middle with a dark gray band. It's almost like a hole in space. And you're like, wait a minute, how does this work? It's, again, this enormous light above it and below, and the reflected light shines off these two hemispheres to create this kind of band of darkness in the middle. It doesn't really look like it should exist in real life. A lot of his works were like that. He would put these discs and illuminate them so that the shadows would overlap. Again, nothing here is painted. Nothing here that you're seeing is painted. This is just the interplay of four shadows overlapping each other from four different lights illuminating this disc in front of us. And so this was the same thing that the modernists were doing with paint, the kind of post-gestural modernists were doing, but here it's being done with light. Douglas Wheeler would kind of take the idea of the canvas and invert it. He would take a canvas and push it off from the wall and light behind the canvas so that we would have this glow around the actual object, giving us the frame. He eventually started doing this with whole rooms. And again, these become just really ethereal places. He's still around and still doing really wonderful stuff. He had a massive installation recently at the Guggenheim Museum where you had a wall. Now, this wall is actually not very far away from you. It's less than 10 feet away from you. But it feels vast and endless because of the way he's lit it. He's lit it to destroy the sense of any kind of depth or horizon. And then these pyramidal forms around you are there to absorb the sound. And only 3 or 4 people are allowed to come into this room at a time. And so all you have is silence and this kind of void floating out in front of you. One of my favorites in this regard is James Turrell. James Turrell was creating light projections. Now, this is such an interesting work of art because as you walk into this, as you look at this object, it looks like what we have is just a glowing cube stuck in the corner of the room. But there's no cube there. In fact, there's nothing physical or tangible there. The projectors are actually up in the ceiling and around the room, projecting a square of light. So what you're seeing there is a complete phantasm. It's an illusion to make it look like there's a cube in that corner, but there's nothing there. It's just the light on the space. He would do that in similar rooms, creating these shallow space constructions. So again, unlike Wheeler, who was like pushing the canvas off the wall and lighting behind the canvas with direct light, that's not created this way. This is created by projecting light right onto the wall and creating what seemingly is a floating object. Eventually, he would create what he calls these Gansfield rooms or series, where this is, this looks photoshopped, but this is an actual view of what it's like to be in one of these rooms. You're completely surrounded with this volume of light. The corners of the room have been rounded off to prevent any shadows, and it just becomes this ethereal glow. It's like actually stepping into a Mark Rothko painting. Just incredible. And he also builds these massive installations with skylights, where the room itself is illuminated with indirect lighting, but the real thing is that it frames a chunk of the sky, so that the sky is a part of the composition. Here's one that he did not too long ago. This is on the campus of Rice University, and it's this large pyramidal mound with this reflective panel with light that changes over time. So these large-scale installations and the use of light ultimately come over into land and earth art. Land and earth art is the natural outgrowth of conceptualism, minimalism, and post-minimalism. Again, the idea is, the problem with art is it can be commercialized. It can be something that can be sold. And so there were a bunch of artists that wanted to get away from the commercialism. And so what better way to do that than to go out and create works of art in nature? Because if you create works on arts in nature, there's nothing to sell. Many times they would actually go out onto public lands and create their works of art in incredibly inaccessible areas. So, you even had to go this enormous distance just to get to the object and to find it. And because you're dealing with nature, natural materials, there was inherently a kind of environmental message. Earth Day, the first Earth Day happened in 1970, so this is right at the rise of the environmental movement as well. Some of this stuff is remarkably simple. One of the first works is like Richard Long, who just walked back and forth in a long line to trample down the grass to create a feature that highlighted the environment. Again, these are very site-specific. That one's not too intrusive. Sometimes they can get very intrusive. Michael Heiser, who's probably the grandfather of land art, cut a huge swath right out of the edges of this mesa. This is in Nevada. And yes, it said Nevada, not Nevada. I grew up in Las Vegas, so just so you know. And you could see he just cut this long line through the landscape. It's almost as if a slot, like a enormous saw had been dropped in and cut at this moment. Now, he's currently building an enormous, probably the largest work of outdoor installation art in the world. This is City. This is also being built out in the Nevada desert. And he's been working on this thing since 1972. I remember reading an article out of the New York Times back in 2012 said that he was just a couple years from finishing. Well, that's been several years now and he's still not finished. It will be an incredible monument. He was inspired by plazas and Mayan architecture, how they managed to create these incredible spaces. Here you can see what it looked like. In 1989, it only had this little section go, but as he's continued to build on it, he has gathered. So you can see this section here is the same as this section here. And so all the rest of this has been built since 1989. There are a series of concrete works that almost act like temples or backdrops or ritual places to be. So not yet open to the public. Presumably when he dies, it will finally be finished. I don't think he'll finish until he dies. And then it'll pass on to the Dia Foundation. The Dia Foundation is a foundation to preserve land art. And Barack Obama actually declared a chunk of the private land around it to be federal land to protect it so that it would always exist. It's amazing, the largest works of art in our time are being created in our lifetime. That's really quite amazing. I have to give massive shout outs to Utah because, again, Utah's my home state here, and Utah is where I teach, and Utah is the site of a lot of land art. Nancy Holt created the sun tunnels. The sun tunnels have tunnels that are made out of concrete, but they're aligned to the sun, and more interestingly, as you get into them, they have holes that allow the light to come through. Perhaps the most famous piece of land art in the world is in Utah, and it's at the north end of the Great Salt Lake, and it's the Spiral Jetty. And it was constructed by Nancy Holt's husband, Robert Smithson. Robert Smithson was creating land art at the time, but he really wanted to tackle something big, and he wanted to do it in a remote area. He noticed that there were, up at the North Salt Lake, he used an airplane to scout for his locations, there were these long jetties, and these were left over from the oil industry. There used to be natural gas drilling at the north end of the Salt Lake, but long since abandoned. And he noticed how these jetties struck out from the shore and gave you something to hold on to as you looked at the landscape, and so he decided to create his own jetty, but to make it spiral. So he actually used an old road from the oil companies and got a couple earth movers and built it. And he built it knowing that the lake, the Great Salt Lake at the time, was actually very, very low. And he knew that it would rise and it would flood this and destroy this. And for most of its life, since it was created in the early 1970s, it had been flooded and was actually underwater. But he didn't care because, again, part of the idea of land art is that it's part of the land. It has the same ebbs and flows as the landscape. And it was actually built to, kind of record the entropy of erosion on the land. Now, I remember the first time I ever went and saw it. I was actually an adult before I ever went and saw it the first time, and I had never thought much about it. You couldn't get away with this today. Land art is really controversial because, of course, you have to go do it, and now we're so conscious about the environment we wouldn't do it. But I was really impressed that without this object, I would never have come to this location, this incredible, vast salt flat. For most of its life, it was underwater, but in the 90s, the lake dropped again. People remembered this, and, it was really hard to get to. In the 90s, there was just this terrible road, and you had to have a 4x4 to get there. Now, it again, too, is owned by the Dia Foundation, which supports land art and has many of the most famous pieces of land art in its collection. So it's a privately owned site, and they helped facilitate the building of a road there so people could see it. And when you go there, people just instinctively walk up the spiral. It has a ritualistic quality. It forces you to look at the horizon and to regard the earth and around you. I described it as an exclamation point on the landscape, and there's no better way to see it. Sometimes an exclamation point is important, but it actually brings your attention to the landscape. Dealing with these kind of environmental issues can be very difficult, but land art oftentimes is in conflict with the environment, but also serves to bring our attention to environmental issues. Perhaps the most important manifestation of what we would call land art today is going to be the works of Christo and Jean-Claude. Christo was a Romanian artist who came to Paris. Jean-Claude was his wife, and they were a team that worked together. And he just passed away. He passed away, I think, in May of this year. So he was active right up until this year. And some of his first projects were, again, wrapping landscapes. This was one of his first, where he wrapped a coast in Australia, this insane amount of fabric. And the idea was, again, to highlight the location. Again, Christo and Jean-Claude refused to accept any money for their works. They there's no way to sell them. So what they would do is they wouldn't take loans either. What they would do is they would sell drawings of their concepts to gain all the money in advance for it, so that there's no way these could be seen as a commercial venture. And then he would get all volunteers. He's wrapped many things, including buildings, but I think his land art is perhaps the most interesting. This was one of his earlier pieces. This was the Valley Curtain. This was hung across a valley in California, and it creates this just dramatic kind of point on the landscape. Perhaps his most famous piece is going to be The Running Fence, which was another one of his earlier pieces, which was a fence that ran over 20 miles of California landscape right to the ocean. And you had these 20-foot poles that were suspended and these enormous curtains that were put up. And again, people resisted this at the time, both as a nuisance to the traffic and to the environment, but they really came to see the wonder of it. It created a kind of ribbon of light that went around the landscape, really truly highlighting the beauty of the landscape. One of the things that he was very careful to do is that his works are only up for a few weeks, sometimes only as much as 2 weeks. So they become, again, an ephemeral thing, a real experience that has to be experienced before they're done. His wrapped surrounded islands in Florida and Biscayne Bay, again, he wrapped them in plastic. These were floating on the water. One of his more recent works, I think, is just really compelling. There was this island in the middle of a lake in Italy, and he connected it to the shoreline with a set of floating piers. And as you can see, they were immeasurably popular. But again, short-lived, ephemeral. You're not creating an object, you're kind of creating an experience. And when it's gone, the experience is gone. But you can see by its display how it's very minimal. It carries on the ideas of high modernism. So high modernism, doesn't disappear. It's still going strong today. It seems like every 20 or 30 years we have a revival of geometric kind of abstraction in painting. And we see, kind of geometric abstraction and minimalism in sculpture. I don't think it's ever going to go away, which is good. But there's also a lots more to talk about. We have one more lecture, and that lecture is a real rip-roarer. We're going to go through basically everything that's happened since the 70s in terms of painting, and just describe where we are in the state of arts today, just a kind of sense of where we're going, just to give you a sense of the landscape. I don't go into too much detail because I teach a whole class on contemporary art. If you're interested in that, you ought to check out that class. Thanks so much. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.